It looked like genuine innovation. But someone else already owned the future. Silent servers hum in the shadowed dark. Security at every turn, controlling the flow. No majority stake was ever required. Just time, influence, and the right signatures. High-altitude deals made at the speed of light. Closed-door agreements that shaped the world. They had to control the power grid. Control everything running on the infrastructure. The grid of influence hums with energy. The hum of authority echoes through the plant. But the infrastructure alone was never enough. They started shaping the people who used it too. Patents on progress stored in deep archives. The next generation of control begins here. Invisible cables became the new invisible borders, and someone owned both the line and the land. Tied to the seabed, hidden from public view. The map of ownership spans the entire globe. Before the servers ever arrived, people disappeared from the entire plan, marking the boundaries of a new empire. The community's voice was silenced by code. When critical resources ran short, the contract had already chosen a winner. A dry future signed in another country, standing in the shadow of digital power. The rules definitely existed, written in deep shadows, just not in the country that signed them. Arbitration held in the silent hallways. The gavel fell far from the people's reach. And so efficiency finally arrived. Ubiquitous surveillance came with it. Watching every bite, every move, every day. Connected, yet never truly alone again. Identity became the new infrastructure. And infrastructure always has an owner, stored in servers you will never see. The digital self is a corporate asset now. One single outage changed everything in an instant. The switch was always there, waiting to be flipped. The crisis revealed something truly terrifying. That control had never actually been local. The public finally saw the hidden clauses. Partnership suddenly meant something entirely else. They checked the system and the infrastructure and found access nobody remembered ever giving. Markets moved before governments even could. Fear travels much faster than any government policy. A generation raised inside the digital system started demanding ownership of their future. For 6 hours, the world stood still, as sovereignty stood waiting outside the gate. The answer wasn't outrage or frustration. It was building something fundamentally different. After years of intense renegotiation, the lights finally carried equal weight for all. The choke point stayed where it was, but nobody held the only key to it anymore. It looks like Silicon Valley. It is owned by no one you'd expect. Behind every gleaming tower, a government you didn't vote for. This is digital colonialism, and it already won. Tech hubs used to grow from garages and universities. Now they're seeded by treaties no one debated, funded by capital with no nameplate, built by hands that answer to a flag thousands of miles away. Every pin on this map is a country that thought it was modernizing. Every light is a hub that thought it was independent. The pattern only becomes visible from far enough away. And by the time you see it, the deal is already signed. They call it investment, strategic investment. They call it partnership, at first, but ownership tells a different story than the press release. And the fine print rewrites who actually controls a nation's future. This isn't the colonialism of soldiers and ships. This is the colonialism of fiber and capital. No invasion, no occupation, just dependency engineered one contract at a time. 3 regions control the machines that make every chip on Earth. Whoever controls those machines controls everyone downstream. So nations stopped competing on ideas. They started competing on who could buy the gatekeepers first. A sovereign fund doesn't need a majority stake. It needs board seats, veto rights, and patience. Patience is the one resource democracies are short on, and patience is the one resource these funds have in abundance. Every data center needs power most cities can't spare, so the funders build their own grids. Once you control the power, you control the uptime. Once you control the uptime, you control the economy running on it. They didn't stop at infrastructure. They funded the universities training the engineers. They funded the labs filing the patents. By graduation, the brightest minds already owed someone a debt. 95% of intercontinental data still travels through cables on the ocean floor. A handful of consortiums control where those cables land. Land the cable and you decide who gets fast internet and who waits. This is the geography of power now, invisible, undersea, and owned. On paper, it's a trade agreement. The smaller nation gets jobs, ribbon cuttings, and headlines. This is the entry point. The smaller nation gets jobs, ribbon cuttings, and headlines. The larger nation gets the deed and the control. Special zones promise local jobs and local growth. What they deliver is local labor and foreign control. The lights stay on, the profits don't stay local. And the zone becomes an island the host country can't quite reach. Somewhere right now, a kill switch exists for a system you depend on. Somewhere right now, a kill switch exists for a system you depend on. It is not just a metaphor. It's a clause in a contract most ministers never read in full. And clauses, unlike soldiers, never announce when they are activated. The silence is the signal. Every new corridor is sold as a leap into the future. Few mention who holds the loan behind the leap. Infrastructure debt doesn't show up on a ribbon. It shows up decades later in the terms nobody renegotiates. From the ground, it's just another office park. From above, the pattern looks deliberate, because it is deliberate, engineered from the start. And what comes next reveals exactly how deliberate. The deals aren't made in parliaments. They're made in transit lounges and private terminals. By the time the public hears about it, the structure is already in motion. Democracy debates, capital just moves, steady and silent. Before the servers come the surveys, Before the surveys come the relocations, a quiet displacement. The land becomes critical infrastructure. The people who lived on it become a footnote in a feasibility study. No company wants its name on the headline. So the structure gets layered: shell company, holding company, fund. By the third layer, even regulators lose the thread. By design, everything is constructed to be invisible. By design, free zones were built to attract capital. They became the easiest place to hide where capital came from. No disclosure requirement, no local ownership rule, just infrastructure and the silence that funds it. Every country has agencies meant to catch exactly this. Most are understaffed, underfunded, and 3 steps behind. The capital moves at the speed of markets. The oversight moves at the speed of government. These projects don't just bring servers, they bring entire ecosystems: housing, security, logistics. A company town rebuilt for the cloud computing era, self-contained, self-governed, barely visible from the highway. When a cable breaks, the world notices in milliseconds. Repair ships are scarce, specialized, and often foreign-owned. Whoever controls the repair fleet controls how fast you reconnect. Dependency doesn't end at construction. It lives in every outage. Some governments do try to push back, a review board here, a disclosure law there. But laws written for last decade's threat rarely catch this decade's structure. By the time legislation passes, the capital has already restructured around it. From outside, every facility looks the same. Same fencing, same lighting, same silence. It is identical across every border. Uniformity is intentional. It keeps anyone from knowing which one matters most. Hide the crown jewel among 100 identical boxes. At every summit, the language is the same. Partnership, innovation, shared prosperity. The slides change. The ownership structure underneath rarely does. It remains hidden in plain sight. And the audience applauds the future being sold back to them. The story always starts the same way. A quiet place, a modest population, a resource no one had mapped yet. Then the surveyors arrive, and the quiet place becomes a node on someone else's network. Nobody asked the village what it wanted to become. They were never part of the conversation. Some of this capital comes from oil. Some comes from state pensions, capital that no one ever traces to the source. Some comes from places no audit has ever fully traced. All of it arrives looking identical on a balance sheet. Even geography bends to the new infrastructure. Mountains get tunneled, rivers get bridged, borders get rerouted around, not through. The terrain stopped being an obstacle the moment enough capital arrived. Now it's simply a line item in a construction schedule. Even the news that covers these deals often runs on the same infrastructure. The cables, the servers, the cloud contracts, coverage of the empire broadcast through the empire's own pipes. Objectivity becomes a question of bandwidth. By the time most people notice the pattern, the foundation is already poured. The cables are laid, the campuses are running, the contracts are signed. What's left isn't a question of stopping it. It's a question of understanding exactly how far it already reaches, into every corner. Step back far enough, and the separate stories merge into one map, one network. A chip fab here, a cable landing there, a sovereign fund's signature on both. 3 different continents, 1 coordinated architecture. This was never a series of isolated deals. Redundancy is the official explanation for the scale. Resilience is the word in every press release. But redundancy this extensive isn't just about uptime. It's about making the system too large to ever be unwound. Somewhere beneath all of this, the truly critical systems sit underground. Blast-rated, climate-controlled, built to survive almost anything. Except perhaps the moment a host nation finally asks who holds the only key. That moment is coming, it always does. The door is closing on independence. To the people living beneath these towers, this is simply progress. What they cannot see yet is the ledger behind the lights, the debt that must be paid. What they can't see yet is the ledger behind the lights, and what that ledger will eventually demand in return. Part 1 of this story ends where most coverage stops, at the ribbon cutting. But the real architecture is only beginning to reveal itself. The deal is just the start. Next, the mechanisms built to make this dependency permanent. And the moment the world started calling it something else. Every smartphone, missile system, and AI model depends on the same tiny object. A chip smaller than a fingernail. 3 regions on Earth can manufacture the most advanced ones. And one of them just found a new way to lock in the other 2. Call it a domestic chip program, and taxpayers cheer. Call it a subsidy to a foreign-controlled subsidiary, and they wouldn't. So the paperwork calls it the first thing. The ownership structure quietly is the second. Local registration, local management on paper, but trace the holding company up far enough and the chain always ends somewhere else. 3 layers of ownership is typical. 5 is when regulators usually give up looking. The machinery of dependency is often invisible. The talent pipeline gets built before the factory finishes construction. Scholarships, apprenticeships, guaranteed jobs for graduates. By the time the ribbon is cut, an entire generation of engineers already owes their career to one employer. Loyalty, manufactured at the source. Data centers are thirsty. Some use millions of gallons a day to stay cool. In water-scarce regions, that thirst competes directly with farms and families. The contracts rarely mention who gets priority when supply runs short. By the time anyone asks, the allocation is already decided. Disputes don't go to local courts anymore. They go to arbitration panels in cities the host country has never visited. Foreign law, foreign judges, foreign outcomes. Sovereignty, signed away in a single boilerplate paragraph. Sovereign funds were built to manage national wealth for the long term. Now some manage long-term leverage over other nations instead. A stake in a port here, a stake in a data center there. Spread thin enough that no single deal raises an alarm, together they raise an empire. When undersea cables aren't enough, the same capital moves into orbit. Satellite constellations promising connectivity to places fiber never reached. Connectivity that runs through ground stations owned by the same handful of funds. The sky, it turns out, has owners too. Even farmland becomes infrastructure now. Sensors mapping every square meter, feeding data to servers the farmer doesn't own. The harvest stays local. The intelligence about that harvest doesn't. Whoever owns the data owns the next decade's pricing power. Digital payment systems were supposed to leapfrog old banking infrastructure. Instead, many simply replaced one dependency with another. The rails are new. The owner of the rails isn't. Every transaction now leaves a trace that flows somewhere beyond the border. Every chip, every battery, every server needs minerals most countries don't have. The ones that do have them rarely control the refining process. Raw material leaves cheap, refined material returns expensive. The margin and the leverage sits entirely with the refiner. Refining capacity took decades to build and concentrate. It won't be replicated overnight, no matter how many speeches promise otherwise. So the leverage holds quietly, patiently, for years to come. Infrastructure dependency isn't a single choke point, it's a chain of them. Smart city contracts promise safer streets and smoother traffic. They also install sensors that report back to servers outside the city's jurisdiction. Efficiency and surveillance arrive in the same shipment. Cities rarely get to choose just one. Health systems digitized faster than most could secure the data. Genomic records, medical histories, entire population's biology stored somewhere by someone. The cloud contract that won the tender rarely discloses where the servers physically sit. A nation's biology, hosted at the discretion of a foreign data center. Supply chains modernized into algorithms most governments can't audit. Every shipment, every delay, every price spike runs through proprietary software. When the algorithm decides what gets delivered first, the algorithm decides who eats first. Logistics became leveraged the moment it became invisible. Digital identity programs promised to bring millions into the formal economy. They also created the largest biometric databases many of these nations have ever held. Built, hosted, and maintained under contracts written far from the people enrolled in them. Identity itself, infrastructure now, and infrastructure has owners. Hardware moves across borders faster than the laws meant to track it. Servers arrive labeled as telecommunications equipment. What runs on them once installed is rarely inspected again. The hardware is visible, the software inside it almost never is. Even the research meant to study this phenomenon runs on funding with its own strings attached. Grants from foundations tied to the very capital under examination. Independent analysis becomes harder to find than the deals themselves. The watchdogs need funding too, and funding has a memory. Some of these tech corridors sit suspiciously close to military installations. Dual-use infrastructure, civilian by day, strategic asset by classification. The same fiber-carrying video calls also carries something the public never sees. Civilian investment and military leverage sharing the exact same cable. Export controls were supposed to keep the most advanced chips contained. Layered ownership made containment nearly impossible to enforce. A subsidiary here, a joint venture there, the technology finds a route regardless. Sanctions chase paperwork. Capital simply reroutes around it. Some regions were promised a clean transition, from extraction to digital infrastructure. The jobs did shift. The ownership pattern didn't. Different industry, same foreign balance sheet at the top. The resource changed. The dependency stayed exactly the same shape. Even the startups meant to disrupt this system need capital to survive. And the capital available at scale often traces back to the same sources. Disruption, it turns out, can be acquired just like everything else. The rebels get funded by the empire they meant to challenge. The most ambitious projects don't separate logistics from data from finance anymore. They merge all three into a single integrated zone. One contract, one operator, one point of control over an entire region's economy. Efficiency by design, concentration by consequence. A handful of analysts inside these regulatory bodies do see the pattern. Their reports rarely make headlines and rarely change outcomes. Not because the evidence is weak, because the political cost of acting on it is high. Knowing isn't the same as being able to act. Ports were the original choke points of global trade. Now they're also data choke points. Every shipment logged, tracked, and analyzed in real time. Whoever built the port software owns the visibility into a nation's trade flow. The ship still flies a flag. The data flows somewhere else entirely. Job creation numbers always look impressive in the press release. What they rarely break down is how many of those jobs sit beneath a foreign management layer. Local hands building, foreign minds deciding. By the time anyone asks, the allocation is already decided. Some renewable projects don't power the country they're built in. They power a single client under a private agreement that bypasses the public grid. Clean energy, dedicated to a server farm, while neighboring towns ration their own. The green transition has a customer list, and it isn't always the public. A few governments are starting to draft their own counter-strategies. Local ownership thresholds, mandatory data residency, real audit power, modest steps, often watered down before they ever reach a vote. But the drafts exist now, and drafts are how every policy eventually begins. Some smaller nations are starting to pool resources instead of negotiating alone. A shared fund, a shared fab, a shared seat at the table. Alone, they're a customer. Together, they start looking like a counterweight. It's early, many dots, but it's the first structural answer to a structural problem. A handful of nations are now building parallel systems entirely under their own control. Smaller, slower to build, far more expensive per byte, but every byte stored there answers to exactly one government. Sovereignty, it turns out, has a price, and some are finally willing to pay it. The next round of negotiations isn't about market access anymore. It's about whether infrastructure ownership counts as a national security issue. Some delegations are starting to say yes, out loud for the first time. That single word changes everything about how these deals get reviewed. That single word changes everything about how these deals get reviewed. A few contracts have already been renegotiated, a few facilities have already changed hands. Not through confrontation, through patient legal pressure and public scrutiny. It's slow, it's incomplete, but it's no longer theoretical. The machinery of dependency has its first cracks. For the first time in years, there's a choice instead of a single default. But a choice that didn't exist when this story began. And choice, however small, is the opposite of colonialism. The machinery built to create dependency is the same machinery that can be redesigned for partnership. Joint ownership, joint oversight, joint accountability. It requires every party at the table to actually want that outcome. It requires every party at the table to actually want that outcome. Not every party does, but some finally are starting to ask for it. The machinery is built, the dependencies are real, the leverage is already in place. But machinery, unlike empire, can still be redesigned. What happens next depends on who decides to look closely enough to act. It started with a routine contract dispute. Within 6 hours, half a city's payment systems went dark. No one called it sabotage, no one called it an accident either. They called it scheduled maintenance that nobody had scheduled. The outage exposed something the contracts never fully disclosed. A single switch, controlled remotely, could throttle an entire nation's banking grid. It had always been there. No one had ever tested it publicly until now. And once tested, it could never be unknown again. The emergency session ran past midnight. Lawmakers who had approved the original deal now faced cameras they couldn't avoid. Outside, a crowd was already asking the question the contract had buried. Whose finger was actually on that switch? A leak surfaced within days, pages from the original infrastructure agreement, clauses about remote access, clauses about emergency override authority, clauses the public had never been shown when the deal was first announced. Suddenly, partnership needed a new definition. The response from the facility operators was immediate. More security, more distance, fewer answers. The silence itself became the story the cameras couldn't stop filming. And silence this time didn't calm anyone down. Behind closed doors, the diplomatic temperature dropped fast. One side demanded full disclosure of every override clause in every active contract. The other called the request a violation of commercial confidentiality. Neither side was willing to blink first. Word spread fast to neighboring tech hubs built under similar agreements. Quiet audits began, often without informing the original contractors. What they found varied. What they found everywhere was access no one remembered granting. The architecture of dependency had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Within a week, 3 separate governments issued emergency security directives. Mandatory disclosure of remote access protocols. Mandatory local backup authority. None of it retroactive enough to undo what was already built, but all of it impossible to imagine happening even a month earlier. Markets reacted before politicians finished their statements. Shares tied to the affected infrastructure funds dropped within hours. Investors who had ignored the risk for years suddenly couldn't ignore it for one more day. Capital that once moved in silence now moved in panic. The operator finally issued a statement. Full cooperation, full transparency, a promise to review every clause in question. The words were carefully chosen. The timeline for action was not. Trust, once broken this publicly, doesn't rebuild on a press release alone. Public anger found its way to the streets faster than policy could catch up. Students who had grown up inside this infrastructure now questioned every assumption about it. The protests were peaceful, but the message was unmistakable. A generation raised on borrowed infrastructure was demanding to own its future outright. A senior official resigned within the month, citing irreconcilable differences over the original agreement. It was the first resignation tied directly to this story. Interior shot of a cabinet meeting room, chairs pushed back abruptly as officials rise mid-discussion. Accountability, once it starts moving, rarely stops at just one name. The scrutiny didn't stay contained to one country for long. Investigators in a second nation opened their own inquiry, using the first leak as a roadmap. Subpoenas followed, hearings followed those. The architecture built to operate in silence was now operating entirely on camera. The testimony that followed exposed gaps even seasoned regulators hadn't anticipated. Override authority that extended further than any public filing had disclosed. Contracts renewed automatically unless actively challenged within narrow legal windows. Dependency, it turned out, had been engineered to renew itself indefinitely by default. Trade slowed as governments began inspecting equipment shipments more closely than ever before. What used to clear customs in hours now took days. The infrastructure that promised seamless connection suddenly hit very real friction. Scrutiny, once activated, doesn't move at the speed markets are used to. Formal diplomatic protests followed within days. Language usually reserved for far more severe incidents now applied to infrastructure contracts. Both sides accused the other of bad faith, and both sides for the first time meant it. Workers inside the facilities themselves began pushing back too. Local engineers hired under promises of advancement, demanding clarity on who they actually answered to. A short walkout, a long list of unanswered questions. The machinery depends on the people running it, and the people were starting to ask why. The operator's crisis team worked around the clock to contain the fallout. Internal memos promised cultural change, external statements promised structural change. Whether either promise survived the next earnings call remained an open question. Crisis management and genuine reform rarely move at the same speed. The story crossed borders faster than any single government could contain it. Other nations, with their own versions of the same contracts, began asking the same questions. What had looked like isolated incidents now looked like a single global pattern finally surfacing at once. The map from Part 1 was no longer a secret, it was a headline. An international body called an emergency session, the first of its kind on this exact issue. Delegates from dozens of countries compared notes that had never been compared before. No binding resolution emerged, but the conversation itself was unprecedented. Sometimes the first crack in a system is simply everyone admitting the system exists. When a government inspection team arrived to audit one facility directly, they were initially denied entry. Private security citing contractual jurisdiction, government officials citing national law. For nearly 6 hours, sovereignty itself stood at a literal gate. The standoff ended only after a call from far above either side present. The inspection that followed lasted 3 full days. What inspectors found confirmed some fears and contradicted others. Access existed beyond what was disclosed, but so did genuine local expertise no one had credited. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either side's headline. Economists began publishing estimates of what true decoupling would actually cost. The numbers were staggering enough to make even angry politicians pause. Independence, it turned out, came with a price tag few budgets could absorb overnight. The dependency wasn't just structural, it was now economically load-bearing. Some governments chose a phased transition instead of an abrupt break. 5 years, 10 years, timelines long enough to be politically survivable. Critics called it surrender disguised as patience. Supporters called it the only realistic path that wouldn't collapse the system entirely. For the first time, the affected nations began coordinating instead of negotiating individually. A shared framework for disclosure, a shared registry of infrastructure ownership. Alone, each had been a customer. Together, they were starting to look like a block. The leverage that built the system might be the same leverage that finally challenges it. Every existing contract suddenly faced fresh legal exposure. Clauses that had gone unchallenged for years were being read line by line for the first time. Compliance teams that had been dormant were suddenly the busiest people in the building. The fine print everyone signed was finally being read out loud. Some disputes escalated beyond contracts into actual territorial questions. Who owns the seabed a cable crosses determines who can ever cut it off. What had been an engineering detail became a geopolitical fault line overnight. Infrastructure disputes don't stay confined to balance sheets for long. A regional alliance moved to formally classify core digital infrastructure as a matter of collective security. An idea that would have sounded absurd in any boardroom 5 years earlier. Now it was simply common sense, written into treaty language. The chaos had forced a redefinition no one had been willing to make voluntarily. One of the largest facilities under scrutiny finally changed hands. Not through expropriation, through a negotiated buyback, funded by a coalition of local investors. It cost far more than the original deal had ever paid out. But for the first time, the deed matched the flag flying outside. What began as a single power outage had become a global reckoning. A dozen countries, a dozen renegotiations, one shared realization. The architecture built in silence couldn't survive being seen all at once. And the world was only beginning to decide what to build in its place. The most consequential response wasn't a lawsuit or a protest. It was capital, pooled, public, and accountable to the nations that raised it. Slower to deploy than sovereign wealth, far harder to weaponize quietly. A counterweight built not from outrage, but from patient coordination. The first project under the new framework broke ground within the year. Same scale as the structures that came before it, entirely different ownership. No single nation held the override clause this time. Every clause now required unanimous consent to activate. From the street, the two systems look almost identical. Same glass, same humming servers, same blinking lights at night. The difference lives entirely in the paperwork no one outside ever sees. But for the first time, that paperwork finally has more than one signature that matters. A year after the first outage, the numbers tell a complicated story. More transparency than before, more local ownership than before, far less than full independence, and no one in the room is pretending otherwise. Progress, this time measured in renegotiated clauses rather than ribbon cuttings. The reckoning didn't end the system. It exposed it and it cracked it open. What gets built in those cracks is still being decided contract by contract. Part 4 asks the question every reckoning eventually has to answer. Who actually owns the future now, and who gets to decide what happens next? 5 years after the first outage, the map looks different. Not unrecognizable, not free of the old structures entirely, but different enough that the question has finally changed. It's no longer who controls the infrastructure, it's who's allowed to ask. The largest new facilities are no longer owned by a single entity hiding behind layers. They're owned by consortiums built specifically so no single layer can hide anything. Every override requires multiple signatures from multiple capitals. Convenience gave way to accountability. Slower, but harder to quietly unwind. Mandatory ownership registries now exist in over a dozen countries. Every shell, every holding company, every beneficial owner, searchable in minutes instead of buried for years. It isn't a perfect system. Determined capital still finds new ways to layer itself. But the default has shifted from secrecy to disclosure, and defaults matter enormously. The old private power agreements have started to expire one by one. Renewals now require public allocation guarantees as a condition of the contract. The lights in the town and the lights in the data center finally run on the same priority. It took an outage, a reckoning, and years of renegotiation to get there. Water sharing agreements followed the same pattern as power. Community priority clauses, once unthinkable, are now standard in new permits. The canal that ran dry years earlier flows again, monitored by the same public registry. Infrastructure built to extract was finally rebuilt to share. A new generation of engineers is graduating without that early career debt to a single foreign employer. Domestic grants, domestic patents, domestic compute clusters built specifically for public research. It costs more per student than the old scholarship pipeline ever did. But the loyalty it builds finally points back toward the country that raised them. Chip manufacturing itself didn't fully decentralize, the cost of trying was simply too high. But ownership did. 3 nations now hold transparent, published stakes in the same facility. No single government holds unilateral override authority anymore. The choke point remains. The keys to it no longer sit in one pocket. Cable landing stations now publish maintenance and outage logs as a matter of public record. When something goes wrong, the explanation no longer waits behind a corporate spokesperson's schedule. Citizens can ask questions directly on a public record with answers required by law. Trust doesn't return overnight, but it can finally start to rebuild, one disclosed log at a time. Some of the original infrastructure debt has finally been refinanced through the new regional development banks. Lower interest, local currency terms, no hidden override clause buried on page 40. It took years of negotiation to get there, and not every nation has managed it yet. But the path now exists where once there was only the original contract's fine print. Even the logistics algorithms have started moving toward open, auditable standards. Not because the original operators wanted to share their advantage, because enough governments finally required it as a condition of doing business at their ports. Leverage, once concentrated entirely in private code, now has to answer to public rules. Smart city contracts now come with data residency requirements written into law, not just promised in a brochure. The sensors are the same. The streets look the same. But the servers receiving that data now sit inside the same borders as the streets themselves. Efficiency stayed. Surveillance, at least the foreign kind, finally had to leave. Health data sovereignty laws followed soon after, in country after country. Genomic records that once sat on servers abroad now sit under a domestic legal framework instead. It cost more to build that infrastructure domestically. No one disputes that anymore. But a nation's biology finally answers only to that nation's own laws. Even orbit has started to diversify. A coalition of smaller nations pooled resources to launch their own shared communications satellite. No single ground station, no single override authority, no single point of foreign leverage. The sky that once had owners now, in at least one orbit, has shareholders instead. The contracts that started this entire reckoning are now part of the public record permanently. Students study them the way other generations studied earlier chapters of economic history, not as ancient history, as a cautionary architecture still being dismantled in real time. The lesson outlived the controversy that forced it into the open. Nations that once competed individually for foreign investment now coordinate collectively on the terms of it. A shared minimum standard for ownership disclosure, a shared minimum threshold for local control. No nation gave up its sovereignty to get there. Each one simply stopped negotiating entirely alone. Collective leverage turned out to be the one thing the original system never anticipated. The final accounting shows real measurable change. Not total victory, but real change. Foreign-controlled infrastructure ownership down, joint and domestic ownership up. The gap didn't close entirely. No serious analyst expected it to, but the direction reversed, and direction is what colonialism, digital or otherwise, has always depended on continuing unchallenged. The newest projects are being designed differently from the ground up. Local override authority isn't an afterthought negotiated in after a crisis anymore. It's written into the blueprint before the first foundation is poured. The lesson got built into the architecture itself, not just into the policy that followed it. Even the sovereign funds at the center of this story have had to change their own playbook. Layered shell structures invite exactly the kind of scrutiny they were built to avoid now. Every override requires multiple signatures from multiple capitals. Some funds have voluntarily disclosed more than regulators ever required. The integrated megaprojects that once concentrated logistics, data, and finance into a single private footprint now require public review at every phase. It slows construction down. Every party involved acknowledges that openly. But it also means the next generation of these projects can't be built entirely behind closed doors. Speed gave ground to scrutiny, and most residents call that trade worth making. The courts eventually weighed in on several of the original disputed contracts. Some override clauses were ruled unenforceable under domestic law. Others were upheld with new conditions attached for future renewal. Neither side got everything it wanted, which in hindsight may be exactly how durable change usually arrives. The rural communities displaced years earlier finally received the benefit-sharing agreements that should have existed from the start. A trust fund, a community center, direct access to some of the very infrastructure built on their former land. It doesn't undo what was taken, no agreement ever fully does. But it's a different ending than the one the original feasibility study had quietly assumed. The fishing village that became a node on someone else's network has finally become a stakeholder in it instead. The same fisherman who once mended nets beside an unmarked fence now holds an actual ownership stake in what stands behind it. The story that began with a quiet place losing its say has ended, at least here, with that say restored. Not every story like this one ends this way. This one finally did. A new multilateral charter on digital infrastructure ownership was finally adopted, years after the crisis that made it necessary. Not a perfect document, several major holdouts still refuse to sign it in full. But for the first time, a shared global standard exists for exactly the practices this story began by exposing. Standards don't enforce themselves, but they give the next generation something to point to that didn't exist before. We return finally to where this story began. The same glass towers, the same humming servers, but the seal on the lobby floor is no longer anonymous, and the directory behind it is no longer hidden. The empire didn't fall, it was simply made visible, and visibility changed what it could still get away with. Digital colonialism didn't end with this story. No single reckoning ever fully ends a pattern this old. But the pattern is no longer invisible, and an invisible pattern is the only kind that survives indefinitely. What replaces it now depends on every contract still being negotiated somewhere tonight, and on whether enough people keep asking the one question this entire story finally taught them to ask out loud. Historians will spend decades debating exactly when this story actually began. Some point to the first chip subsidy, others to the first undersea cable contract signed in silence. The honest answer is that it began the moment infrastructure became invisible enough to stop being questioned. And it will only end the moment it becomes impossible to make invisible again. The engineers building the next generation of infrastructure were trained inside this entire reckoning. Transparency isn't an afterthought to them. It's simply how the job has always been done in their experience. That shift in expectation may end up mattering more than any single law that was passed. Culture, once it changes, is harder to quietly reverse than any contract ever was. Not every region reached this same ending. In some places, the original pattern continues almost entirely unchanged. New unmarked gates, new anonymous seals, new journalists just beginning to ask the questions this story already answered elsewhere. The reckoning was real. It was also unmistakably incomplete. What does exist now for the first time is a permanent global tracker watching for exactly this pattern. Public, searchable, updated continuously by analysts from the very nations once targeted by it. It won't stop the next attempt at quiet dependency from being designed, but it ensures that attempt now has to survive being watched from its very first day. The pattern from the very first scene of this story is still visible from above, but it's no longer a single shape controlled by a single hand. It's a patchwork now. Public, joint, private, contested, and resolved all at once, depending entirely on where you look. That patchwork, messy as it is what an actual reckoning looks like in practice. On the 5th anniversary, the public celebration wasn't for a company or a deal. It was for a law, the one that first required disclosure most of the world now simply assumes as a baseline. A baseline this story's opening scenes never imagined the public would ever get to assume. Progress, it turns out, sometimes looks exactly like a holiday nobody expected to need. This story is now taught in some classrooms as a case study rather than breaking news. Students debate whether the reckoning went far enough or whether it simply repackaged the same dependency more politely. Both arguments have real evidence behind them. That tension may be the most honest ending available. Some empires fall. This one so far has only been forced to finally explain itself. Somewhere, one of the original anonymous server racks now sits behind museum glass. Visitors read the placard and move on to the next exhibit, the way people do with history that no longer feels urgent, which may be the clearest sign that something genuinely did change. The journalists who broke the original leak finally published their closing chapter. Not an ending exactly, more of a marker showing exactly how far the story has traveled. Readers who lived through every stage of it finished the piece with a very different feeling than the one they started with. Less fear, more clarity, and a far longer list of questions they now know exactly how to ask. Digital colonialism promised a future owned by whoever moved first and stayed quietest the longest. What actually arrived was a future that had to be renegotiated in public by everyone it was built on top of. Neither outcome is the ending anyone originally wrote into the first contract, which may be exactly the point. The future was never theirs alone to write in the first place. Which may be exactly the point. The future was never theirs alone to write in the first place.